Shalom Malcolm Hoenlein, Vice Chairman of the Conference of Presidents.
Thank you. It's good to be with you again, as always, and to be before the Arutz Sheva audience, very important one.
So we're here at the gathering of the Conference of Presidents in Jerusalem. One of the main topics here, of course, Iran, but also the question, what will America, the United States, do regarding Iran?
Well, we've been working on this for many years, going back to the late 80s when we started warning about dangers of a nuclear Iran. We saw the trends in Iran, and I led the efforts on behalf of the Iran 13, which enabled me to establish ties with a lot of Iranian officials whom I negotiated, including Zarif. I did in his home. I was for a month negotiating with them and eventually saw the release. But I established ties that it continued and enabled us to get certain insight into what they were doing, what they were thinking. The situation inside the country is much worse than people know. The COVID took a toll that they tell me was perhaps 5 or 10 times greater than what they said. But even more, the drought is eating up half the country. Millions and millions of people have moved into the cities. The currency, they lopped off at one time 4 zeros from the currency. So people's pensions are worthless. People are, living very difficult lives, but they're willing to do it, and they're willing to take additional sanctions, they tell us, if we help them against this regime. They are oppressed by the regime, and this has nothing to do with the nuclear or non-nuclear. It's what's happening in the country. 50% of college graduates are unemployed. There are no jobs for people. And the long time it took them to get the medicine, for instance, so they blamed it on sanctions of the West. The Western sanctions don't apply to it.
But how could and should the world reach the people of Iran?
The first thing is that we should be making public statements. We should be standing up. Unions should stand up for the bus drivers and the others who go on strike. There are 6,000 strikes a year in Iran now. Who reports on them? People put their lives on the line. Many of them lose their lives in anti-government actions. When hundreds and hundreds of thousands were marching saying, we will not die for Gaza, we will not die for Hezbollah, we will die for Iran. And America twice said, we don't get involved in family feuds or internal feuds. That killed it. The people are looking to the West for support. They don't want rifles, they want fax machines, they want communication. They want to be able to show that somebody cares out there for what they're doing. And so it's imperative that Western governments show that we stand up for them, we speak up for them, and that the actions that we take, there should be contingencies that reflect the violations of human rights, the regional aggression by Iran, a global aggression by Iran, which we can talk about. But we focus on a narrow part, which is nuclear. It's vital, we have to, but we should also be demanding on the ballistic missiles, let alone on conventional weapons and all things which are often in violation of UN sanctions, not American sanctions, like the missile program. So they say we're shooting into space missiles. They're not going into space. They're doing it because they're developing their ballistic missile capacity. And at the same time, they're being more aggressive globally, regionally and globally. And now with the alliance with China that buys 3/4 of their oil, they got an influx of $25 billion from this. Even UAE bought oil from them. And the Russians are involved with them, each for their own purpose. And there isn't such a great relationship between Russia and Iran going back to the Second World War.
And what should Israel do at this point? Are we back to the days of, Netanyahu speaking out against Obama at the Congress?
No, we're not going to go back to those days because this government is not going to take that approach. And many members of Congress are not in support right now. When Senator Menendez, the Democratic chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, can get up and give this dynamic speech against the negotiations in Iran, not saying we don't want to see an outcome. Everybody would like to see something that stops them from getting to 90%, 60%. The problem is that if you simply take away the centrifuge and say, put them in storage, they'll be back in 10 minutes. And with their know-how now, they can take what used to take a football field to put it in a small office space. They know they have the know-how. You can't take that away from them. So even if you ship out the enriched uranium, they can reproduce it now. There's nothing that stops them. Plus, they have the secret facilities and are demanding that all the IAEA cases be dropped.
This brings us to the topic of the Abraham Accords. We're seeing lots of business, lots of tourism, but also in these important issues of Iran, of security. You see potential in the Abraham Accords?
I'm committed to it. I believe it. I started in the Gulf 25 years ago, and people said it was crazy what we were doing. I reached out in the UAE 15 years ago, Saudi Arabia 7 years ago, Morocco 30 years ago, and I believe that the peace that's being reached now will be different than Jordan and Egypt in that they're starting off as a peace of the people. Certainly in the UAE, we see it. In Bahrain, we see it. Less so in Morocco. Look what the king has done, how they've changed their textbooks. Saudi Arabia, UAE, Egypt, Morocco, changed them, took out the anti-Semitic components and anti-Israel components. They don't get any credit for it. The Palestinian Authority textbooks get worse, but they have actually made changes. And we should acknowledge it, that they have Holocaust Memorial Days, that they're fixing up Jewish sites in Egypt and Morocco and in Saudi Arabia, the digs near Khaybar. But nobody tells you the positive side of the story. And these things are reflective of a trend. I meet all the leaders of these countries, and I honestly believe that it's Iran that's driving it in one hand, but there's a positive motivation as well. And frankly, we're seeing it in many other countries that are going to, I believe, in a not distant future, come into some arrangement. You know, we started the Mediterranean Initiative 13 years ago between Greece, Cyprus, and Israel. Look how it's burgeoned. Now Morocco wants in, Malta wants in, Bulgaria, Romania, all because they see that our initial vision of taking Israel out of the Middle East and put it in the Mediterranean has great potential now with the Gulf coming together.
Okay, so Malcolm Hoenlein, we're here at the gathering in Jerusalem. You all flew in from the United States. How do you summarize, how do you look at what many defined as a crisis between Israel and Jewish diaspora regarding the restrictions of entry to the State of Israel during the pandemic?
So I take a different position than some of my college people I respect, but I think calling it a moral disgrace is incorrect. Every country has not only responsibility and obligation to set rules to protect their citizens. The rules may be wrong, but they have that right. It's not a moral disgrace to make a decision and say citizens are treated differently than foreigners. Every country has rules. You look at the lines at the airport, you know that citizens get special treatment. I think that the problem was in the implementation, that it was not consistent, that people claim corruption, people claim other things in the way that it was being conducted. So people without inoculations were getting in because they had right connections or pay, and people who had inoculations were not getting in. And many people, when there were life events, funerals, weddings and stuff, so there has to be a better system, but I don't think it's fair to talk about Israel breaking the covenant with the Jewish people. I don't think that is the case. And you know what, in fact, I think for many Jews will not take Israel for granted like they did before, when we could just get on a plane, you buy a ticket, you go. Now they realize how important Israel is to our lives, how central it is. There's a huge pent-up demand that I think we will see after Pesach, how many people will start coming. I hear it from non-Jews who have really missed the opportunity to be here, let alone the Jewish community. So I'm hopeful, and I hope all the youth groups and the government should be encouraging it, and we're going to be doing things to help with tourism. I met the tourism minister, I met others, ministers who want to work with us creatively and find new ways, and we hope to bring again, like we did before, through America's Voices, the leading movie stars and others who can talk to the American people and say, hey, this is the best place in the world to visit. It's safe. Don't worry about COVID. And so I'm very hopeful.
Malcolm Hoenlein, Vice Chairman of the Conference of Presidents, thank you very much.
You're very welcome.